The most dangerous mistake a powerful man can make is believing the woman beside him does not understand exactly how much of his empire she helped build. Daniel Whitmore stepped out of the private elevator on the 72nd floor with the relaxed confidence of a man returning home after what should have been an ordinary 3-day business trip, one expensive Italian leather duffel bag hanging casually over his shoulder while the soft hum of Manhattan traffic drifted faintly through the insulated glass walls surrounding the luxury penthouse he had spent 6 years calling home. But the second he reached the entryway, something felt immediately wrong. It was not obvious at first, nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just silence, the kind of silence that feels unnatural when you know exactly what normal sounds are supposed to exist. No soft jazz music playing through the integrated home audio system the way Olivia always left it running in the evenings. No faint scent of vanilla candles burning near the marble fireplace, no quiet footsteps somewhere deeper inside the apartment. Only stillness so absolute it made the entire 12,000 square foot penthouse feel abandoned. Daniel frowned slightly and stepped forward, polished dress shoes clicking sharply against imported white marble floors as late evening sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows stretching across the skyline. His eyes scanned the massive open-concept living room. And confusion immediately tightened across his face because the room looked wrong, violently wrong. The custom Italian sectional sofa near the glass wall was gone. The 2 abstract sculptures Olivia spent nearly 4 months negotiating through a private art broker in Geneva had vanished completely. Even the 7-foot grand piano positioned beside the terrace entrance no longer occupied the polished hardwood platform where it had stood for years. Daniel slowly lowered his duffel bag to the floor while his pulse began accelerating in quiet disbelief. The walls looked strangely empty now. Entire sections of luxury artwork removed cleanly, leaving pale rectangular outlines where expensive frames had once hung. He turned toward the garage access panel near the kitchen and instinctively pressed the security display. Loading vehicle status, unavailable, both Aston Martins missing, Range Rover unavailable, Bentley unavailable. He stared silently at the screen for several seconds before pulling his phone from his pocket and immediately dialing Olivia. 1 ring, voicemail. Daniel frowned harder now and began walking deeper into the apartment, every step revealing more absence. The wine collection cabinet completely emptied, designer luggage sets gone from the hallway storage closet, half the furniture missing with surgical precision as though someone had dismantled an entire life according to detailed blueprint instructions. Then finally he saw it, resting alone in the exact center of the kitchen island atop polished Calicata marble illuminated by golden sunset. Reflecting through the west-facing skyline windows, a single cream-colored envelope. Daniel approached slowly, suddenly aware that his breathing had changed. His fingers hesitated briefly before lifting the envelope and unfolding the single sheet of paper waiting inside. The moment his eyes reached the first paragraph, the color drained visibly from his face. Legal dissolution documents, immediate asset transfer authorization, executive legal notices filed across 3 separate jurisdictions. Attached signatures already approved by corporate counsel. And at the very bottom beneath the final page, written in elegant familiar handwriting he knew better than his own signature, sat one final sentence that caused every thought inside his head to stop moving entirely. You should have stayed. For several long seconds Daniel Whitmore remained standing motionless beside the marble kitchen island as evening sunlight stretched across the half-empty penthouse like the final moments of a world quietly collapsing around him. The legal document still trembling slightly between his fingers while his mind struggled desperately to process what his eyes were seeing. None of it made sense. Not the missing furniture, not the vanished vehicles, not the cold precision of the asset transfer notices already signed by attorneys whose names he recognized immediately as some of the most aggressive corporate litigators in New York. But more than anything, what unsettled him was Olivia's handwriting at the bottom of the page, calm, elegant, controlled. There was no anger in the message, no desperation, no emotional accusation, just certainty, the kind of certainty people only carry when every move has already been calculated far in advance. Daniel suddenly grabbed his phone again and dialed her number a second time, straight to voicemail. He ended the call immediately and began pacing toward the main living area where the absence of everything now felt far more disturbing than the objects themselves. 6 years of marriage had taught him many things about Olivia Carter, but unpredictability had never been one of them. Olivia was disciplined, structured, emotionally controlled even during difficult moments. She was the type of woman who organized household financial reports down to exact percentages despite living in a 12,000 square foot penthouse where neither of them ever needed to worry about money again. She disliked chaos, hated unnecessary drama, and approached life with the quiet intelligence of someone who always understood systems better than people around her realized, which meant one terrifying possibility had now become impossible to ignore. This had not happened impulsively, this had been planned. Daniel immediately opened his banking application and typed in credentials with growing urgency, but before the dashboard fully loaded, a red notification appeared across the screen: account access temporarily restricted pending legal authorization review. Daniel froze, then quickly opened his secondary investment account tied directly to Whitmore Capital Holdings. Same notification. His breathing sharpened instantly now, and without hesitation he pulled up the company executive network portal used only by senior board members. Password denied. Access credentials suspended by board compliance review. No, Daniel whispered under his breath while immediately opening his email inbox, where dozens of unread messages had begun flooding the screen over the past 30 minutes. Legal compliance notification. Emergency shareholder vote initiated. Executive authority temporarily revoked pending internal investigation. Acquisition committee leadership reassigned effective immediately. Daniel stared at the screen in disbelief as wave after wave of institutional notifications continued arriving faster than he could fully read them. Then his phone vibrated again. Incoming call. Gregory Lawson, Chief Financial Officer. Daniel answered immediately. Greg, what the hell is happening right now? But on the other side the older man sounded strangely distant. I was instructed not to discuss active board proceedings directly with you at this time. Daniel stopped walking entirely. Greg, I am the chief executive officer of this company. But Gregory interrupted him quietly. Not anymore, Daniel. Effective 2 hours ago the board approved emergency suspension under shareholder protection clauses triggered by majority controlling interest activation. Silence swallowed the penthouse entirely now. Daniel slowly lowered himself against the empty wall where a 7-foot abstract sculpture once stood and felt something dangerously unfamiliar moving through his chest for the first time in years. Fear, real fear. Because only one detail inside Gregory's words truly mattered now: majority controlling interest activation, which meant somehow during the 3 days he believed he was enjoying a perfectly hidden escape far from New York, Olivia had done something he had never imagined possible. She had somehow reached directly into the center of his empire and taken control of the very company he spent the last decade building. And for the first time since stepping off the private elevator 20 minutes earlier, Daniel Whitmore finally understood this was not divorce, this was war, and somehow his wife had already won before he even knew the battle had started. 3 days earlier the penthouse had looked exactly the way Daniel Whitmore preferred everything in his life to appear: flawless, expensive, and perfectly under control. Morning sunlight poured through 72 floors of uninterrupted Manhattan skyline while soft instrumental jazz drifted through hidden ceiling speakers, and the scent of freshly brewed Ethiopian coffee filled the 12,000 square foot residence where every piece of imported furniture had been selected personally by Olivia over the course of nearly 2 years. She stood near the marble kitchen island dressed in an elegant ivory silk blouse tucked neatly into tailored cream trousers, one hand resting against a leather portfolio while reviewing quarterly foundation reports for one of the family's charitable investment divisions. Across from her, Daniel adjusted the cufflinks on his charcoal Brioni suit while glancing briefly toward the massive Rolex resting around his wrist, his expression calm, composed, polished in the effortless way men often become when life has taught them the world naturally bends in their favor. Olivia looked up from the documents and smiled faintly. You are leaving earlier than usual. Daniel reached for the espresso sitting beside him and nodded without hesitation. San Francisco investor meeting got moved forward last night. Apparently the Horizon Capital people want final acquisition terms settled before market opens Thursday. Olivia studied him for a moment longer than normal, not suspicious yet, simply observant, because after 6 years of marriage subtle behavioral shifts had become easier to recognize than words themselves. Daniel rarely rushed in the mornings. He hated changing travel schedules unexpectedly, and normally before corporate flights he spent at least 20 minutes reviewing final presentation notes aloud while pacing near the windows. Today he had done none of those things. Instead his phone remained face down on the counter almost the entire morning, which alone felt strangely unlike him. She stepped closer and adjusted the collar of his suit instinctively the way she had done hundreds of times before board dinners and international conferences. "How long this time?" she asked quietly. Daniel smiled, leaned forward, and kissed her forehead with practiced warmth. "3 days at most, back Friday evening." Olivia nodded slowly, although something beneath the surface of that answer settled strangely against instinct. Daniel turned toward the private elevator access hallway but paused halfway before glancing back. "You do not have anything major scheduled while I am gone, right?" Olivia closed the portfolio and smiled softly. "Nothing I cannot manage." Daniel gave one final nod and disappeared toward the elevator, while moments later the quiet mechanical hum signaled his descent toward the private underground garage 3 floors below. Silence returned almost immediately, but unlike the peaceful silence she normally enjoyed when the penthouse emptied each morning, today something felt unfinished somehow. Olivia stood motionless beside the kitchen counter, staring absently toward the closed elevator doors until her own reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows suddenly shifted focus toward one tiny detail sitting forgotten beside Daniel's abandoned espresso cup, his secondary phone, the smaller black encrypted device he only carried during sensitive executive negotiations. Daniel never forgot that phone, not once in 6 years. She stared at it for several seconds before slowly reaching forward and picking it up. The screen remained locked at first, but within seconds a notification banner illuminated automatically across the display, and what she saw caused every calm thought inside her mind to stop moving entirely. "Aspen Grand Meridian Resort welcomes you, Mr. Whitmore. Your luxury mountain suite is confirmed for arrival this afternoon." Olivia did not blink, did not move, did not react outwardly at all. But somewhere deep beneath the silence, standing inside that perfect Manhattan penthouse, a single invisible fracture had just opened quietly across everything she believed her marriage still was. Because one thing now stood impossibly clear: Daniel Whitmore had not boarded a flight to San Francisco that morning, and whatever truth waited behind that lie was about to change everything. For nearly a full minute Olivia Carter stood motionless beside the marble kitchen island with Daniel's forgotten secondary phone resting cold in her hand, while sunlight continued spilling across the penthouse in the same peaceful golden silence that only seconds earlier had felt ordinary. But now every familiar detail surrounding her suddenly seemed artificial somehow: the jazz music drifting softly through hidden speakers, the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air, the expensive abstract paintings hanging perfectly against imported Italian walls. 6 years of marriage had taught her to trust patterns more than promises, and one truth immediately began forming with terrifying clarity inside her mind: Daniel Whitmore never forgot important things, not passwords, not schedules, not acquisition timelines, and certainly not the encrypted phone he exclusively used during sensitive corporate negotiations involving 8- and 9-figure transactions. Yet somehow on the exact morning he claimed to be flying across the country for urgent investor meetings, he had left behind the single device connected to that world entirely. Olivia slowly lowered herself onto one of the leather bar stools near the kitchen island and stared again at the notification glowing across the screen: Aspen Grand Meridian Resort. Luxury mountain suite confirmed for arrival this afternoon. Aspen, Colorado, not San Francisco. Not anywhere remotely connected to Horizon Capital or the acquisition deal Daniel mentioned less than 15 minutes earlier. Instinctively she unlocked her own phone and opened Whitmore Capital's internal executive calendar application, where major investor meetings were routinely logged for compliance visibility across senior leadership teams. Her eyes moved quickly through the week's schedule and immediately stopped. Thursday board review meeting confirmed, Friday earnings presentation confirmed. But nowhere across the entire calendar did Horizon Capital appear once. No acquisition discussions, no San Francisco meetings, absolutely nothing matching the explanation Daniel had casually given her over breakfast. Olivia sat in silence, allowing the information to settle without forcing immediate emotion, because unlike most people she had spent years learning that panic often destroys clarity, and clarity was the only thing she trusted when life suddenly stopped making sense. She looked down at Daniel's abandoned phone again, and within seconds another notification appeared automatically across the lock screen: Flight services confirmation updated. Aspen arrival vehicle transfer scheduled for 2 passengers. Olivia stared at the final 2 words longer than everything else surrounding the message: 2 passengers, not 1. For the first time since discovering the original resort confirmation, something sharp moved quietly through her chest. Not sadness, not anger, something colder than either emotion: calculation. Because suddenly dozens of tiny moments from the past 4 months began rearranging themselves into patterns she had unconsciously ignored while trusting the man she married, late-night executive dinners lasting suspiciously longer than usual, sudden password changes across shared travel applications, Daniel taking calls privately on the balcony despite previously conducting business conversations openly beside her for years. Then there was Vanessa Cole, his executive assistant, 27 years old, brilliant, polished, dangerously ambitious. Olivia remembered noticing months ago how Vanessa always positioned herself just slightly too close during corporate functions while Daniel never seemed particularly eager to create distance. Back then Olivia dismissed the thought immediately because trust inside marriage should never be poisoned by insecurity manufactured through imagination alone, but now imagination no longer mattered, evidence had begun replacing doubt. Very calmly Olivia placed Daniel's phone beside her own, then reached for the silver MacBook resting closed near the dining area and opened it slowly. Her reflection stared back at her briefly against the black screen before system login appeared. She typed 6 familiar passwords before accessing a private encrypted legal archive few people in the world knew existed: marriage agreements, corporate ownership structures, shareholder rights distribution. And nested quietly inside those documents sat one detail Daniel had likely forgotten years ago because success often makes powerful men dangerously careless. Legally, Olivia Carter did not merely share his home, she held controlling proxy rights attached to 38% of Whitmore Capital's voting structure through foundational agreements established during the company's earliest growth years, and as morning sunlight stretched further across Manhattan below, one devastating realization settled calmly across her thoughts with absolute certainty. Whatever Daniel Whitmore was doing in Aspen with another passenger, by the time he returned home 3 days from now his life would no longer belong to him. Olivia Carter had always believed betrayal revealed itself long before people realized they were betraying you, not through dramatic confessions or careless mistakes but through patterns, subtle shifts in routine, microscopic fractures hidden beneath behavior so ordinary most people never notice until trust has already begun quietly dying beneath the surface. And now seated alone inside the penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, she stared at 3 separate screens arranged neatly across the marble dining table while the calm expression on her face remained so controlled it would have terrified anyone who truly understood what silence often means when intelligent people stop feeling emotion and begin thinking strategically instead. Daniel's forgotten encrypted phone remained beside her left hand while financial reports pulled directly from Whitmore Capital's internal executive archive loaded across her laptop display, and for nearly 20 minutes she cross-referenced travel confirmations, corporate scheduling logs, expense account authorizations and private aviation routing data connected to the Gulfstream jet Daniel had reserved that morning under executive transportation protocol. The pattern became undeniable almost immediately. There had been no San Francisco clearance filed through the corporate aviation department. Instead, flight authorization records showed private route transfer from Teterboro Airport directly to Aspen Regional Airport, departing 48 minutes earlier carrying 2 approved passengers under executive confidentiality override status. Olivia leaned back slightly in the leather chair and closed her eyes for one brief second because confirmation had now replaced suspicion entirely. Daniel had lied deliberately, and wherever he was going he had not gone alone. But strangely, what unsettled her most was not the possibility of infidelity itself, because deep beneath the immediate betrayal another instinct had begun whispering something far more dangerous. Daniel rarely risked anything unless profit existed somewhere beneath the decision, which meant if he was lying this carefully then whatever he was hiding likely reached beyond personal betrayal alone. Very calmly she opened the executive expenditure ledger attached to Whitmore Capital's restricted financial movement accounts and began tracing transactions Daniel had personally authorized over the last 90 days. At first nothing unusual appeared: standard acquisition expenses, international consulting fees, compliance retainers. Then suddenly her eyes stopped moving altogether. 5 separate wire transfers, each totaling exactly $4,800,000, had quietly moved over the past 6 weeks through shell consulting entities registered in Delaware, Luxembourg, and Cayman Islands under subsidiary structures she had never seen before. Olivia immediately recognized the tactic: layered Asset migration disguised through intermediary holding corporations specifically designed to remove liquidity before pending regulatory discovery or internal shareholder review. She zoomed further into the transaction trail, and what she found next caused even her carefully disciplined breathing to pause momentarily. Final receiving beneficiary: Cole Strategic Ventures LLC, Registered Managing Officer, Vanessa Cole. For nearly 10 full seconds Olivia simply stared silently at the screen while sunlight continued shifting slowly across the penthouse floors around her, not because she was shocked anymore but because the scale of what Daniel had done had now changed everything. This was not a husband making reckless personal choices during a secret weekend away from home. This was calculated corporate fraud hidden beneath the exact company structure both of them had spent years building together. She thought briefly about the first days of Whitmore Capital nearly 7 years earlier when Daniel possessed vision but almost no institutional support. She had been the one structuring early trust agreements, negotiating private equity introductions through her father's legal network, drafting foundational shareholder protections that eventually helped transform his small investment firm into a multi-billion-dollar financial empire dominating sectors across New York and Chicago. Daniel may have become the face of Whitmore Capital, but Olivia had built the architecture holding every critical piece together, and now staring at financial evidence proving her husband had secretly begun siphoning millions into offshore structures connected directly to the woman likely waiting beside him in Aspen. One final truth settled over her thoughts with perfect terrifying calm. Daniel Whitmore had not simply betrayed his marriage, he had attempted stealing from the empire they built together while assuming the woman beside him remained too trusting to notice. And in that exact moment Olivia quietly understood something he had disastrously forgotten: the most dangerous person in any collapsing empire is never the one standing at the top, it is the architect who designed the foundation beneath it. For nearly an hour after uncovering the offshore transfers, Olivia Carter remained seated in absolute silence while the towering Manhattan skyline stretched endlessly beyond the penthouse windows. But inside her mind every emotion had already begun separating itself into clean, organized compartments the same way she had approached every high-level corporate negotiation throughout her career. Betrayal occupied one space, disappointment another, anger somewhere further back where it could not interfere with decision-making. Because Olivia understood something most people never learn until far too late: emotion may reveal truth but strategy determines survival, and right now survival no longer meant protecting her marriage. It meant protecting the empire Daniel Whitmore had quietly begun stealing from beneath her while assuming she remained nothing more than the elegant wife smiling politely beside him at charity galas and executive dinners. Very slowly she reached for her private phone and opened a contact list reserved exclusively for matters too sensitive to ever touch company communication systems. Without hesitation she pressed the first name: Margaret Ellison, senior partner at Ellison & Brooks Corporate Litigation. The line connected after 2 rings, and before the woman on the other side could finish greeting her, Olivia spoke with the calm precision of someone already moving 3 steps ahead of everyone else involved. Margaret, I need an emergency shareholder enforcement package initiated immediately, and I want temporary executive suspension protocols drafted under breach of fiduciary conduct statutes. Silence followed briefly before Margaret answered carefully, That sounds serious, Olivia. Should I assume Daniel finally made a catastrophic mistake? Olivia stood now and began walking slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park several thousand feet below. Transfer records confirm approximately $24 million moved offshore through unauthorized shell structures connected directly to Vanessa Cole over the past 6 weeks. Legal authority packages need filing within 2 hours. Margaret exhaled sharply on the other side. Understood. I will notify Securities Counsel immediately. Olivia ended the call and immediately dialed a second number. Gregory Lawson, Chief Financial Officer of Whitmore Capital and one of only 3 executives who had remained loyal to her since the earliest startup years before Daniel became a recognized face across financial magazines nationwide. Gregory answered almost instantly. Olivia, everything all right? She stared quietly at the city below before responding. Greg, I need a confidential board meeting assembled under emergency governance review before market close today. There was a brief pause. That usually requires Daniel's authorization. Olivia's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Not under shareholder proxy clause 17 subsection 4. I still control 38% direct voting authority and another 12 through trustee leverage agreements Daniel forgot existed. Another pause followed before Gregory's voice lowered carefully. If this moves forward, the board will understand exactly what this means. Olivia nodded, although he could not see her. Good, I want them to understand very clearly. Within the next 15 minutes, legal teams began moving across Manhattan while Olivia remained standing perfectly still watching. Sunlight slowly disappeared behind the city skyline, emails were sent, compliance review notices triggered, banking institutions quietly flagged suspicious outbound transfers connected to Daniel's executive authorization chain. Corporate governance attorneys began drafting immediate suspension motions tied directly to internal financial misconduct exposure. And somewhere thousands of miles away in Aspen, Daniel Whitmore was likely enjoying expensive wine beside the woman he believed nobody knew existed, while completely unaware that the infrastructure supporting every piece of power beneath his carefully constructed world had already begun collapsing one silent legal document at a time. Olivia finally walked back toward the kitchen counter and stared briefly at the framed wedding photograph still sitting untouched near the marble island. 6 years of partnership frozen forever behind polished glass. She picked it up slowly, studied Daniel's smiling face for one final second, then placed it gently inside a cardboard archive box already waiting beside the door where movers would arrive before sunset. Because one truth had now become beautifully unavoidable. Daniel Whitmore believed he had spent years building an empire powerful enough to protect him from consequence. But by the time his private jet landed back in Manhattan 48 hours from now, he was about to discover something devastatingly simple. The woman he underestimated had been quietly holding the keys to his entire kingdom all along. By late afternoon, the machinery of Olivia Carter's revenge had already begun moving with the quiet efficiency of a billion-dollar system executing precisely the way it had been designed years earlier. Inside a private conference suite 40 floors above Park Avenue, 6 senior attorneys from Ellison and Brooks Corporate Litigation sat around a polished walnut table reviewing the first wave of legal filings while encrypted financial documents projected across a 12-foot digital display revealed every offshore transfer Daniel Whitmore believed he had hidden successfully behind layered shell corporations. Olivia stood at the far end of the room wearing the same ivory silk blouse from that morning, but somehow now carrying herself differently, calmer, colder. As though the woman who spent 6 years protecting a marriage built on trust had quietly disappeared the moment evidence replaced doubt and left behind only the strategist who understood exactly how power moves when people stop mistaking kindness for weakness. Margaret Ellison adjusted her glasses while scanning the final compliance review notice and looked toward Olivia with visible professional admiration. I have to ask because I genuinely need to understand how he forgot this existed. Olivia crossed both arms and stared at the digital contract displayed across the wall where one clause sat highlighted in red legal annotation. Because Daniel stopped reading the documents years ago, success made him arrogant enough to believe titles mattered more than structure. Margaret nodded slowly. Clause 17 remains airtight. Majority voting authority transfers automatically if executive misconduct threatens shareholder exposure, which means legally speaking once the board sees these offshore transactions you can suspend him immediately without requiring his approval. Olivia gave a faint expressionless nod. Initiate phase 2. Within minutes another attorney seated nearby activated secured communication channels connected directly to Whitmore Capital's board members spread across New York, Chicago, Boston, and Washington, while emergency governance review notices began appearing inside executive inboxes carrying legal language severe enough that no one receiving them would misunderstand the scale of what was unfolding. Simultaneously, Gregory Lawson had already begun locking internal Treasury movement protocols preventing Daniel from accessing any remaining unrestricted liquidity, while secondary compliance teams quietly flagged all outbound executive authorizations tied directly to accounts Daniel personally controlled. Somewhere across Colorado, Daniel likely believed he still occupied the center of a world obeying his commands, while the reality forming beneath him had already shifted irreversibly. Olivia turned toward the massive conference room windows overlooking Manhattan traffic moving endlessly below, and for one brief second memory pulled her backward 6 years to the earliest days of Whitmore Capital when none of this existed yet. Daniel sitting beside her inside a tiny rented office downtown wearing cheap department store suits because venture funding had not arrived yet, late nights spent together reviewing investor decks while she personally restructured his entire shareholder framework to protect the company from hostile acquisition risks once growth accelerated. Back then Daniel used to joke that without Olivia the company would have collapsed before surviving year 2, and she remembered smiling because unlike him, she understood the joke was never actually a joke. Whitmore Capital had never truly belonged to Daniel alone, no matter how often media magazines labeled him visionary founder and celebrated his face across financial covers nationwide. She had designed the architecture, negotiated the institutional leverage, built the legal foundation every future success rested upon, while allowing him to stand publicly at the center, because marriage meant partnership and partnership required trust, but trust once broken transforms quietly into consequence. Margaret approached, holding one final packet of documents, and extended them toward her. Asset seizure filings are ready, luxury property transfers approved. Executive compensation freeze activated effective immediately. Olivia accepted the folder without changing expression and signed the final authorization pages with elegant deliberate strokes before handing them back. Somewhere far beyond Manhattan skyscrapers, Daniel Whitmore was still enjoying the illusion of freedom he purchased through betrayal. But by sunrise tomorrow every account, every title, every luxury car, every piece of power he believed belonged exclusively to him would already be legally moving beyond his reach, and standing there watching evening shadows slowly swallow the city below, Olivia understood with perfect clarity that revenge never needed rage when intelligence alone could dismantle an empire far more completely than anger ever could. While the legal machinery dismantling Daniel Whitmore's empire accelerated across New York with ruthless efficiency, nearly 1,800 miles away high above the snow-covered mountains of Aspen, Colorado, the man himself sat completely unaware inside the upper terrace lounge of the Grand Meridian Resort with the relaxed expression of someone convinced life remained permanently under his control. Evening sunlight reflected brilliantly across endless white slopes stretching beyond the luxury ski village below, while waitstaff in tailored black uniforms moved quietly between private cabanas serving imported wine and handcrafted cocktails to a carefully curated world where billionaires, celebrities, and investment elites temporarily escaped consequence behind mountains expensive enough to feel disconnected from ordinary reality itself. Daniel leaned comfortably against a heated leather lounge chair, wearing a charcoal cashmere overcoat thrown casually over an expensive black turtleneck, while beside him Vanessa Cole sat laughing softly at something he had said moments earlier, her platinum blonde hair catching golden light against oversized designer sunglasses resting effortlessly atop her head. She reached toward the crystal glass in front of her and smiled with the dangerous confidence of someone who had spent years understanding exactly how proximity to powerful men eventually transforms into opportunity if patience is executed correctly. Daniel raised his own glass and stared briefly toward the distant mountains. Hard to believe in 48 hours I have to go back and spend another month listening to analysts panic over fourth quarter projections. Vanessa laughed quietly. I still cannot believe she has not noticed anything yet. Daniel's expression barely changed as he took another sip. Olivia notices everything. That has always been both her greatest strength and most predictable weakness. Vanessa studied him curiously. Meaning what exactly? Daniel exhaled slowly and leaned back further against the chair. Meaning she trusts systems more than emotions, which makes her brilliant inside boardrooms but dangerously easy to predict at home. Vanessa smiled again and shifted slightly closer. You really think transferring everything this fast was smart? $24 million disappearing tends to attract attention eventually. Daniel finally turned toward her, and for the first time that afternoon a trace of arrogance sharpened visibly across his face. Vanessa. In 6 months Whitmore Capital is absorbing Horizon Strategic Assets, and once that acquisition finalizes I will quietly liquidate enough international exposure to move permanently beyond regulatory oversight structures in the United States. Cayman entities remain invisible if layered correctly, and by the time anyone notices discrepancies the funds will already be protected offshore. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, and Olivia. Daniel gave a dismissive smile, almost amused by the question itself. Olivia spent too many years believing loyalty creates security. She understands legal structures better than anyone I know, but she stopped paying attention to me personally years ago. Marriage made everything predictable. Routine creates blindness, and people stop seeing danger when comfort becomes permanent. Somewhere far below on the resort grounds a black SUV quietly arrived carrying private courier documents Daniel never noticed while his phone remained resting face down against the glass table beside him completely untouched for nearly 2 hours. Had he looked he would have already seen 37 missed calls, 12 legal notifications, 4 compliance suspension alerts, and a rapidly growing list of unanswered messages from executives whose loyalty had begun shifting the exact second Board authority turned against him earlier that afternoon. But arrogance often creates the cruelest blindness of all, and Daniel Whitmore had spent far too many years believing intelligence alone guaranteed invincibility. Vanessa leaned closer and smiled again while mountain winds moved softly through the open terrace overlooking Aspen's endless winter skyline. "Tell me honestly, Daniel, after everything is finished, are you actually going to leave her?" Daniel stared silently toward the mountains before answering with complete confidence. "Olivia built stability for me. But stability is not the same thing as freedom, and somewhere across the country inside a Manhattan penthouse already being emptied piece by piece by professional movers executing legal asset transfers under signed court authority." Olivia Carter stood watching city lights ignite one building at a time, knowing with perfect certainty that the man who believed he understood power better than anyone else in the world was about to learn exactly how dangerous it becomes when you betray the one person quietly controlling everything beneath your feet. By the second morning of Daniel Whitmore's carefully planned escape to Aspen, the invisible collapse of his empire had already reached a stage no amount of influence or executive authority could reverse. Inside Whitmore Capital headquarters in Midtown Manhattan, 27 floors of polished corporate perfection had transformed overnight into something colder, quieter, almost surgical in atmosphere as legal teams moved between executive offices carrying sealed compliance documents while internal communications servers quietly began revoking Daniel's administrative access across every division he once controlled without question. Inside the primary boardroom, Gregory Lawson stood near the 12-foot glass conference table reviewing final authorization notices beside 6 board members whose expressions reflected the same uncomfortable realization settling over the room. The man they had spent years following as visionary chief executive officer had not only concealed $24 million through offshore structures but had directly exposed the company to federal securities review by transferring capital through unauthorized entities tied personally to an employee under his direct authority. One board member adjusted his glasses while staring down at the financial evidence projected across the digital wall and exhaled quietly. "I cannot believe he thought nobody would notice movement this aggressive." Gregory folded both hands calmly behind his back before responding. "Daniel stopped believing oversight applied to him years ago. Arrogance tends to distort risk assessment faster than intelligence corrects it." Meanwhile, 40 blocks south, a convoy of professional movers continued systematically clearing the final contents from the Whitmore penthouse under legal property reassignment orders executed less than 12 hours earlier. Luxury artwork worth nearly $2 million had already been cataloged and transferred into secured climate-controlled storage under Olivia Carter's sole ownership, while both Aston Martin's and the Bentley, previously registered jointly under marital trust agreements, had been relocated overnight to a private holding facility in Brooklyn pending final title restructuring scheduled for later that afternoon. Inside the nearly empty residence, Olivia stood quietly near the floor-to-ceiling windows wearing a fitted white silk blouse and tailored black trousers while holding a leather binder containing the last remaining documents still requiring authorization. Behind her, Margaret Ellison reviewed updates arriving through encrypted legal channels and allowed herself the faintest smile. "It is done. Executive suspension approved unanimously. Asset freeze completed. Compensation trust dissolved. Secondary holdings transferred under protective marital ownership statutes effective immediately." Olivia stared silently at the city skyline glowing beneath pale winter sunlight before speaking for the first time in nearly 10 minutes. "And the offshore accounts?" Margaret nodded once. "Federal compliance flags activated 37 minutes ago. Once Daniel attempts access, every transfer becomes part of active investigation review." Olivia closed the binder slowly and placed it against the marble counter where wedding photographs had once stood only yesterday. 6 years condensed now into silence and paperwork. Somewhere in Colorado, Daniel was still likely smiling confidently, believing the world remained exactly as he left it, while beside him sat the woman quietly helping him dismantle everything he thought belonged exclusively to him. What made the situation almost tragic was not his betrayal itself but the astonishing confidence with which he assumed Olivia remained blind to every move happening beneath her own roof. Margaret glanced toward her carefully. "Are you sure about the final step? Once he lands, there is absolutely no reversing what happens next." Olivia finally turned away from the skyline and her expression remained impossibly calm, almost elegant in its detachment. "I stopped protecting Daniel the exact moment he decided stealing from me was safer than telling me the truth. At that exact second, thousands of feet above Colorado skies, Daniel's private jet reservation updated, automatically confirming departure scheduled in less than 3 hours for direct return to Manhattan. He still had no idea that by the time the aircraft touched down, the title Chief Executive Officer would no longer exist beside his name. Every bank account carrying his authority would already be frozen beyond access. And the woman he believed had spent years quietly standing behind him was about to become the single person responsible for erasing every piece of the life he thought betrayal would never cost him. 42,000 feet above the American Midwest, Daniel Whitmore sat comfortably inside the cream leather cabin of the Gulfstream G700, watching late afternoon sunlight spill across endless clouds outside, while the low mechanical hum of the aircraft created the kind of peaceful isolation he had always associated with control. There was something uniquely satisfying about private air travel that reminded him exactly how far he had climbed from the uncertain startup years when success still depended on convincing skeptical investors to believe in ideas no one else could see yet. Now billion-dollar acquisitions moved according to his schedule, board members adjusted strategy around his decisions, and entire sectors shifted when Whitmore Capital entered negotiations. Across from him, an untouched crystal glass of 12-year-old Macallan rested beside scattered Aspen resort invoices, while his phone lay casually on the armrest, flashing silent notification after notification he had not bothered checking since takeoff nearly 90 minutes earlier. Beside him, the empty seat where Vanessa had been sitting before departing separately earlier that morning now looked strangely symbolic somehow, although Daniel himself remained far too relaxed to notice irony unfolding around him. He leaned back and finally reached for his phone, deciding to send Olivia the routine message he had prepared before landing, something ordinary enough to preserve normality. Home in 2 hours, meeting ran longer than expected but acquisition looks promising, save me dinner. He typed quickly and pressed send without hesitation. Message failed. Daniel frowned slightly and checked signal routing. Strange. He attempted again, same failure, temporary communication interruption perhaps, nothing worth concern. Instead, he opened his banking application, planning to verify one pending offshore transfer scheduled to finalize through Luxembourg intermediary structures sometime that afternoon, but the second the login sequence processed, a red security banner appeared immediately across the screen. Account access restricted, pending authorization review. Daniel stared for a moment before trying again, same result. His expression hardened slightly now, and instinctively he opened the executive management portal connected directly to Whitmore Capital internal systems. Loading error. Access credentials suspended. That was impossible. He sat upright immediately and attempted the secondary executive compliance portal reserved only for senior leadership review. Identical result. Temporary authorization revoked under board review status. For the first time since leaving Aspen, an unfamiliar tension moved sharply through his chest. No one suspended chief executive access without his direct approval. His thumb moved faster now, dialing Gregory Lawson's number, but the line disconnected after one ring. He tried again, straight to voicemail, then another call, legal counsel, no answer, senior acquisitions director, voicemail again. Daniel stared at the screen now, noticing dozens of missed notifications flooding every corner of the display. 17 missed calls, 13 unread executive messages, multiple encrypted legal alerts carrying compliance headers he recognized immediately from prior investigations involving hostile acquisition defense procedures. He opened the first message and felt the muscles in his jaw tighten instantly. Emergency shareholder governance action approved. Executive authority suspended effective immediately pending internal financial misconduct review. Daniel blinked once, reading the line again, slower this time. Impossible. He immediately opened the second notification. Treasury operations freeze confirmed. All outgoing financial authorizations connected to executive account holder Daniel Whitmore suspended until further review. Third notification. Federal Securities Compliance Inquiry triggered regarding unauthorized offshore transfer activity involving associated shell entities registered under Cole Strategic Ventures. The name hit harder than everything else combined. Vanessa. Suddenly the silence inside the private jet no longer felt luxurious, it felt dangerous, suffocating somehow. Daniel stood abruptly and stared toward the cabin windows where distant storm clouds had begun forming far ahead over the darkening horizon, while every carefully constructed certainty inside his mind started collapsing one brutal realization at a time. Someone had discovered everything. But far more terrifying than exposure itself was understanding the speed with which all of this had happened: suspension approvals, frozen accounts, board intervention, federal compliance flags. None of that occurred randomly, and certainly not within mere hours unless someone with intimate structural access had initiated every step deliberately. And in that exact second, as the aircraft began descending toward Manhattan airspace, one final horrifying truth struck Daniel Whitmore with devastating clarity: there was only one person in the entire world who knew his empire well enough to destroy it this completely, and by the time his plane touched the runway below, Olivia Carter had already finished turning every piece of power he once possessed into something he could no longer reach. The drive from Teterboro Airport into Manhattan had never felt longer in Daniel Whitmore's life, and for the first time in nearly a decade the familiar view of New York's glowing skyline rising against the dark evening sky brought him no sense of control, no reassurance, only an oppressive silence growing heavier with every block. The black executive sedan carried him closer toward the penthouse where he already knew Olivia was waiting, somewhere between the private jet landing and crossing the George Washington Bridge. He had stopped trying to call anyone entirely because every number connected to his world had become equally useless. Gregory Lawson refused to answer. Legal counsel had redirected him straight to compliance voicemail. 3 board members who once treated him like the architect of their financial future had ignored repeated calls altogether, and even the private banking division responsible for managing nearly half his liquid assets informed him through automated security messaging that all account authority had been temporarily suspended under active federal review protocols. By the time the car finally stopped outside the private residential tower, Daniel no longer felt anger. What moved through him now was something colder than rage, disbelief sharpened by humiliation, because no matter how carefully he replayed the last 72 hours inside his mind, one fact remained impossible to fully comprehend: Olivia had somehow moved faster than an entire executive legal division normally could, and that meant one thing only. She had begun preparing this long before he ever boarded the flight to Aspen. The private elevator carried him upward through 72 silent floors, while every passing second tightened pressure inside his chest harder than anything he had experienced since launching Whitmore Capital nearly 7 years earlier. Then finally the doors opened, and the moment he stepped inside the penthouse, reality struck with brutal finality. The emptiness looked worse now than it had in the photographs. Legal compliance had quietly attached earlier to one of the executive asset seizure notices he had ignored during descent. The 12,000 square foot residence no longer looked like home. Entire walls stood bare where million-dollar artwork collections once hung. The massive custom Italian sectional had vanished completely, leaving only polished floor outlines where expensive furniture had occupied the space for years. The grand piano near the terrace entrance was gone, crystal sculptures gone, wine cellar emptied. Even the custom walnut dining table where he and Olivia had hosted countless charity dinners for executives and investors had disappeared entirely, leaving the room feeling cavernous and disturbingly unfamiliar. Daniel stepped forward slowly, with his overnight bag still hanging forgotten beside one shoulder, while the mechanical sound of the elevator doors closing behind him echoed through the empty penthouse louder than normal. Instinctively he moved toward the underground vehicle access panel near the kitchen and activated security display. Vehicle status unavailable. Aston Martin unavailable, Bentley unavailable, Range Rover unavailable, every luxury vehicle gone. He exhaled sharply and reached again for his phone, opening his primary brokerage account through pure desperation despite already knowing what waited. Account frozen, secondary account frozen, international investment portfolio restricted pending federal authorization review. Daniel stared blankly at the glowing red warnings filling the screen before slowly lowering the phone toward his side and turning instinctively toward the massive marble kitchen island standing alone beneath the soft golden light still embedded inside the ceiling architecture above. And there, exactly where Olivia had left it earlier, sat the cream-colored envelope he had already seen hours ago but now somehow understood far differently. Beside it rested one final object he had not noticed before: their framed wedding photograph. The silver frame turned carefully face down against the marble surface as though 6 years of shared life had already been formally archived like a closed corporate account no longer carrying value. Daniel stood motionless staring at it while every silent detail surrounding him finally forced the truth into perfect, devastating focus. Olivia Carter had not simply discovered his betrayal, she had Systematically erased every visible piece of the life he built while ensuring he would return home personally to witness exactly what losing everything actually feels like. And standing alone inside the hollow shell of what used to be his empire, Daniel Whitmore understood for the first time that power means absolutely nothing when the person who helped create it decides you no longer deserve to keep it. For nearly a full minute Daniel Whitmore remained standing perfectly still beside the marble kitchen island while the silence surrounding the empty penthouse pressed against him harder than any confrontation ever could. The city beyond the 72nd floor windows continued glowing with the same restless Manhattan energy that had once reflected everything he believed his life represented: success, influence, control. But now those same skyline lights felt strangely distant, as though the world itself had quietly moved on without asking whether he was prepared to lose everything attached to the identity he had spent years constructing. Slowly he reached again for the cream-colored envelope resting on the polished marble surface and this time unfolded every page carefully instead of skimming through the legal language in disbelief. Immediate marital dissolution filing approved under emergency fiduciary breach provisions, luxury property reassignment executed under joint trust asset authority, executive compensation suspension confirmed through emergency board review protocols. Every sentence struck with surgical precision because unlike emotional revenge driven by anger, this had been built through structure, law, planning, and intimate understanding of the exact empire he once believed only he controlled. Then suddenly, another sound emerged behind him, soft footsteps crossing polished marble floors from somewhere near the terrace entrance. Daniel turned immediately, and the moment his eyes found Olivia Carter standing several feet away, the breath inside his lungs seemed to stop entirely. She wore an immaculate white silk tailored suit with subtle gold cuff detailing catching warm overhead light while her blonde hair rested neatly against one shoulder. Every detail about her appearance radiated calm authority in a way he had somehow never fully noticed before, but what unsettled him most was not the elegance itself, it was the complete absence of emotion across her face. There were no tears, no visible anger, no trembling betrayal, only stillness so composed it felt almost impossible standing in front of the woman whose marriage he had spent the last 3 days quietly destroying. Daniel stared at her for several seconds before finally forcing words through the tension closing around his throat. "Olivia, what exactly have you done?" She said nothing at first and simply walked slowly toward the kitchen island before stopping opposite him, one hand resting lightly against the polished marble where their wedding photograph still sat face down between them like evidence from a life already concluded. When she finally spoke, her voice remained soft and perfectly controlled. "I think a better question would be why you believed I would never notice." Daniel exhaled sharply and stepped forward. "Listen to me, whatever you think happened, this can be explained." Olivia's eyes lifted toward him for the first time fully, and somehow that calm expression carried more force than shouting ever could. Aspen Grand Meridian Resort, unauthorized offshore transfers through Luxembourg intermediaries. $24 million redirected through Shell Corporations registered under Vanessa Cole's holding entity. Private executive confidentiality override activated under false investor travel authorization. She paused briefly before continuing with devastating precision. "Would you like me to continue, Daniel, or have we already moved beyond pretending honesty still matters here?" His expression hardened instantly now as disbelief began mixing dangerously with humiliation. "You destroyed my company over assumptions." Olivia tilted her head slightly. "Assumptions?" Then very deliberately she reached inside the leather folder resting beside her and removed several printed banking records before sliding them across the marble toward him. "Federal compliance flagged every transaction 8 hours ago. The board suspended you unanimously under shareholder protection statutes I personally drafted 6 years ago. Every account carrying your authority is frozen pending securities review. And legally speaking, Whitmore Capital no longer belongs under your executive control." Daniel stared silently at the documents before lifting his eyes again, and for the first time since entering the penthouse the reality of what stood before him finally became undeniable. This was not the wife who spent years standing quietly beside him smiling politely through executive dinners and charity galas. This was the architect of the empire itself, the woman who understood every foundation beneath his success better than he ever bothered remembering. Olivia watched the realization settle slowly across his face and then spoke one final sentence with chilling calm. "You betrayed the only person who built systems strong enough to protect everything you owned, Daniel, and the moment you decided stealing from me was safer than respecting me, You stopped being the man I ever intended to save. For several endless seconds after Olivia's final words, the entire penthouse fell into a silence so heavy it no longer felt like absence but consequence itself, settling permanently over the wreckage of everything Daniel Whitmore had once believed could never be taken from him. He stood frozen across the marble kitchen island, staring at the woman he had spent 6 years believing he understood, only now realizing with devastating clarity that somewhere along the way he had mistaken her loyalty for dependence and her quiet intelligence for harmless support. Outside, the 72nd floor windows Manhattan continued glowing beneath the midnight skyline exactly as it always had. Yellow taxi lights moving endlessly through the streets below while distant helicopters crossed between skyscrapers where entire industries still operated, unaware that one of the city's most powerful executives had just watched his life disappear piece by piece through the hands of the only person who knew exactly how to dismantle it completely. Daniel finally exhaled sharply and ran one trembling hand through his dark hair before lifting his eyes toward Olivia again, his voice lower now. Stripped entirely of the arrogance he carried so naturally only days earlier. How did you even move this fast? Olivia studied him quietly for several seconds, and for the first time all evening something almost resembling sadness moved faintly across her face, although it vanished before fully existing. Then she stepped away from the marble counter and walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city they once built together from ambition and shared sacrifice. When she spoke, her voice remained calm but softer somehow. Do you remember our second year together? Daniel frowned, slightly confused by the question, but said nothing. Olivia continued while staring toward the skyline. You had just lost the Harrison acquisition because legal protections were weak and investors were preparing to pull out. You sat in this exact apartment convinced Whitmore Capital would never survive another quarter. I stayed awake for 36 hours rewriting your corporate governance framework and negotiating emergency trust agreements through every private legal contact I had. She slowly turned back toward him now. I built the architecture that allowed your company to become untouchable, and every protection system you trusted for 6 years existed because I designed them before you ever understood why they mattered. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the legal papers still scattered across the kitchen island, and for the first time genuine regret began replacing disbelief. Olivia reached into the leather folder resting beside the counter and removed one final document before placing it carefully in front of him. Official transfer confirmation naming her acting executive authority over Whitmore Capital pending permanent board restructuring. Daniel stared blankly at the signature lines before whispering almost to himself, "You took everything." Olivia nodded once. No, Daniel. I took back everything I helped create before you decided I was too blind to notice you stealing it from me. Silence returned again while somewhere far below the city carried on without interruption, as if wealth itself had never truly mattered to begin with. Then Olivia reached beside the counter and lifted the final object remaining in the empty penthouse. The silver-framed wedding photograph still turned face down exactly where she left it earlier. She stared at the image for one final moment before gently placing it into the cardboard archive box waiting beside the door where every remaining piece of their shared life had already been packed away permanently. Daniel looked at her one final time now with something broken behind his eyes. I never thought you would do this. Olivia picked up the box calmly and moved toward the private elevator entrance without hesitation before stopping just long enough to offer him the final truth he would carry long after losing everything else. That was your biggest mistake, Daniel. You spent years believing power belonged to the person standing at the top when the truth is power always belongs to the person who understands how the entire system works underneath. Then without another word the elevator doors opened softly behind her and Olivia Carter stepped inside carrying the last remaining memory of a marriage already reduced to paperwork, while Daniel Whitmore remained standing alone in the hollow shell of an empire he once called his life, finally understanding far too late that betrayal becomes truly expensive when you underestimate the woman who helped build the kingdom you thought you ruled alone.